Um, I want to start by expressing gratitude for the ability to be here. And thank you, Roshi, for inviting me to join you all in community. And thank you for that lovely introduction. I appreciate being back. With that said, there's going to be a bit of a plot twist for those of you who are in SEBT and receive the emails with, the talk title and the description. When I was touching base with Roshi, she informed me of all of the amazing astrological and meaningful things going on, which explains a lot in terms of where I am and what I've been experiencing. But I, originally picked the title and topic for this talk maybe about a month ago. But out of respect for where I am now, and in the spirit of authenticity and integrity, there's been a slight change in order to ground what I'm saying with where I am and where I feel like a lot of us are as we are moving through these shifts and transitions and continuing the work of 2020 and before and after. As you know, or as you may know, we celebrate a blood moon today. And yesterday we experienced a full moon, which occurs when the moon simply orbits around the Earth about every 30 days. So I want to explore what it means for things to come full circle and what happens when things that are done in the dark are finally brought to the light. So when I looked up what a blood moon actually is in terms of science and how it occurs, essentially a blood moon happens when a full moon moves through the Earth's shadow. And, the sun still has contact with the moon's surface and is still reflecting light. And that's basically that red and orangish hue that we see reflected off of the moon, and we call it a blood moon. So in other words, blood moon is the effect of shadows or things, as I mentioned, that, are done in darkness, like the rotation of the moon. It comes into contact with light. And I sat with the symbolism of this and what that can mean for us as people who are witnessing this transformative moment and are in the midst of many transformative moments. What does it mean for, the shadows and the darkness of our subconscious and the things that we planted in our minds and the seeds that we have sown as a result through our action? What does it mean for those things to be brought to the light and finally come to fruition? So for me personally, recognizing the co-occurrence of the blood moon and aligning that with what I've been feeling, as I was struggling to stick with the original plan for this Dharma talk, and also just moving through transitions in my own life. And trying to really contextualize all of these emotions and these experiences from everything that we've all witnessed collectively and individually. And processing what does it mean right now to sow new dreams and to uproot old, harmful, and toxic patterns and ways of thinking. And even though I, am discussing a personal transformation to some degree, which for me has been unsettling and disruptive as transitions often are, I again recognize that my own experience is not decontextualized or removed from what's occurring in our culture, with all of us experiencing shifts where, nations and societies are also being called to sow new dreams and uproot old and harmful patterns, whether that's white supremacy, American imperialism, classism, you name it, so on and so forth. So with that consideration, course, nations are made up of people and individuals. So of course, things that affect me and affect us personally have an effect on all of us. And I also think about this as someone who experiences systemic trauma and oppression, being a Black woman, being, queer myself, as someone who's also internalized a lot of that thinking because I'm American. I grew up in this society. So even being oppressed by certain systems, I'm still internalizing that and inflicting that harm myself because I'm not separate from the systems that have shaped me. And even so, that becomes more complex as I think about occupying land, the land of people who are actively being erased despite their very alive and real existence. So for me, I'm in Los Angeles, and that's the land of the Topa people.
Do you want to listen to that?
Whichever's easiest.
Well, I can hear this, but I can't hear.
Is someone unmuted?
It was somebody I muted.
Got it. Thank you. So yeah, so this personal conversation and in context with this national conversation that has been ongoing, and is tied to what we're experiencing globally and what we're witnessing, for example, in Israel and Palestine. All of these things are very much tied to the practice. So these conflicts of sorts, and I say conflict, and I know I just spoke of very violent systems like white supremacy. I mentioned what's going on in Israel and Palestine. I want to be clear on the difference between conflict and violence. They are two totally different things, although when we as people are often called to engage conflict, it's not uncommon to employ violent methods in order to avoid the transformation and discomfort and the lack of predictability and control that comes with the transformative process of conflict. But that said, as we're being called to sow these new dreams and uproot these old and harmful patterns, I want to be very attentive to our relationship to grief and impermanence in this process. So I mentioned grief, I mentioned impermanence, and what I mean by that is, the practice calls us to not only be aware of, but to lean into our relationship with impermanence. Our relationship with impermanence, when not brought to our awareness, and when allowed to just sit there in the subconscious and those dark alleys of our mind, can frequently drive our action instead of inform it. And when we operate subconsciously without guidance and attention of what's going on for us, all of the things that we've kept in the dark, our fears and anxieties and our resistance, those fears and those things that we subconsciously push down, of course, have consequences that reflect the very darkness that it hides. So an example of that would be someone who is subconsciously afraid of losing their power out of fear of feeling powerlessness. And that fear of powerlessness is directly tied to a fear of impermanence. Folks who fear, probably most of us, who fear powerlessness, fear vulnerability. They equate vulnerability with weakness. They equate weakness with failure. They equate failure with death. And death, of course, death with a small d and death with a big D, both of those are intimately connected to impermanence. And whenever there's something that we fear, especially if we aren't intimately aware of that fear, there's something to protect. And the subconscious mind and our actions will go through extraordinary lengths to protect whatever it is we feel called to protect if we aren't aware. So when we aren't aware of what's happening for us subconsciously, and if we aren't aware of our relationship to impermanence and the grief that's related to it, then we, despite our best intentions, even those of us who are invested in a socially engaged Buddhist practice, will inflict harmful dynamics against others in order to avoid actualizing the very things that we fear. And I'll go into more examples of that, as I talk, but generally, I feel that we are all guilty of this when we aren't aware of how fear of loss and fear of impermanence is operating in our life. And whether or not it's intentional or not intentional, the consequences of that harm and the trauma that we inflict remains the same for the people that we're coming into contact with, and especially for the people that we are serving in a socially engaged Buddhist context, whether that's as a hospice or palliative care chaplain, as someone working in a hospital, a social worker, a therapist, community organizer, artist, whoever it might be. All of these dynamics remain relevant because we are constantly in community with people, which means that we are constantly, encountering these dynamics. So this fear that I'm describing, this fear of the reality of impermanence and fear of loss and everything that stems from it, and the lack of awareness of it, and the grief associated with it, again, can cause us to enact harmful dynamics on a larger scale when this is the culture that we live in, and the culture breeds this lack of awareness. And what this can look like on a smaller scale, it can look like, of course, harming those who come into intimate contact with us, whether it's a person that we're dating and they try to open up to us and we are defensive out of fear of being vulnerable, or whether we are crossing someone's boundaries because we view boundaries as rejection as opposed to an attempt to stay in connection and community with someone, or on a larger scale, on a societal scale, where we are looking at racial and ethnic violence and genocide. These are all seeds that have grown long ago, since the beginning of human existence, as people have sought ways to subvert power, avoid conflict, and essentially avoid their relationship to impermanence and the grief that stems from it, in an attempt to buy themselves more comfort and more time, right? I've used the term grief a couple of times. I've also used the term impermanence, and I have it explain that because I know that most of us are familiar with the practice and know what impermanence is. But I want to go into more detail about how I'm using and defining grief specifically as it relates to impermanence. Because typically when I talk about grief, people's minds go to concrete and past loss, things that have happened in the past, have already occurred, but have no bearing on the present aside from our memory and our attachment to that memory. And this could be anything from, death of a dog as a child, the loss of a grandparent, divorce of parents, moving from your hometown, whatever it might be. Typically, when people think of grief, they're thinking about, things that have already occurred. But as we explore grief in relationship to the reality of impermanence, a reality that, as I mentioned, has been around since the beginning of human existence, and is ever consistent, ever present, which means that, it's past, present, and future. I invite each of us to look at grief as something that's bigger than what's already happened to us, something that's bigger than past and concrete loss, and to understand grief contextually as something that is very much connected to the present and very much connected to the future, as something that is tied to impermanence, which we are experiencing from moment to moment. And therefore, if grief is connected to the present and it's connected to the future, it's also intimately tied to the things that we fear, to the things that we love, to who and what we aspire to become. So making this shift in understanding grief has direct consequences on our ability to not only affect daily change in our personal lives, but to also affect larger social and political change, starting with the communities that we're serving and where we are on a day-to-day basis. Because what each of us are called to do as socially engaged Buddhists is to engage our own relationship to impermanence and to suffering and the grief associated with it, and then use that transformation as a resource to support our work in transforming others and transforming systems. You know, if systems are made up of people, then if we use our own practice and the transformation that stems from that to assist in transforming others, then we inevitably transform these larger systems, regardless of how long it takes. And I know many of us are familiar with the Four Noble Truths, the truth of suffering, the cause of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the path. And if you haven't noticed a theme, essentially the Four Noble Truths have a lot to say about suffering, right? So we all suffer. It is driven that home very clearly. And one of the primary causes of suffering is desire. And that includes our desire to change the reality of suffering itself, which ironically kind of enhances suffering. I don't know, Buddhism, what can I say? So going back to the first noble truth, specifically on the reality of suffering, another major cause of suffering, in addition to desire, is our relationship to impermanence. We again know that life is impermanent. And the idea that things are constantly changing and shifting, and our desire and recognizing our desire to change that reality, also has a lot to say about our relationship to suffering and how we enhance our suffering in some ways that are necessary. But the key here is that whenever we are discussing impermanence, we are inherently discussing loss, right? And whenever we are discussing loss, we are inherently discussing grief. More often than not, with a lot of the folks that I work with, grief really gets a bad rep, especially when working one-on-one with clients. When I'm working with hospice and hospital patients, there still is some grief avoidance, but it's the presence and the reality of grief is much more palpable. That having certain conversations is certainly easier than having conversations around grief with someone who isn't forced by external circumstances to explore something that they otherwise find is uncomfortable to delve into. And I find that, a consistent misconception for people who aren't familiar with impermanence and what that means and aren't familiar with practice is that they feel that grief automatically has a negative connotation. So, again, they tie it to past loss, concrete loss, something that they don't want to think about. Or they tie it to an unwanted transition, like something that they didn't consensually give up or didn't want to lose. And therefore, for a lot of these folks, grief is connected to sadness. But if impermanence is embedded in our experience as human beings from day one, then we are constantly in a state of transition and flux, which means, and yet we notice that we don't constantly feel sad, right? Which must mean that grief is more complex than we initially give it credit for. And I think this really boils down to, what I was saying earlier. I gave conflict as an example and the extent to which people try to control circumstances out of, fear of feeling that sense of powerlessness and lack of control. associated with impermanence and not wanting to let things go. So that grasping and that grasping mind can really just perpetuate all sorts of toxic dynamics. But typically when people think of grief, and if they're thinking of it in the context of sadness, they think of lack of control, and then they likely, from my experience of working with folks one-on-one, don't recognize the presence of grief in circumstances where they are under the illusion of control, because again, we are all experiencing impermanence moment to moment. So an example would be someone who is welcoming a career shift that they were actually looking forward to and something that they initiated themselves, right? And if it is self-initiated and they are excited about it, maybe they're excited about the title change or the change in pay or going to a new location, whatever it might be, that transition and the impermanence that comes with it feels positive for the most part. And even so, even in that quote unquote positive transition, there's often a sense of underlying sadness that comes with, the feeling of loss, whether it's having to learn a new path to work, learn new systems, meet new people, say goodbye to people that those folks knew and appreciated. There's still grief within that moment or within those positive moments that often aren't noticed if the change feels welcome, and if it feels like there's some sort of agency and consent in bringing about that change. When we numb ourselves to the reality of impermanence on a day-to-day basis, and only notice those major transitions like death at the end of life, or only notice grief when it's essentially hitting us across the head like 2020 with a bunch of unexpected transitions that weren't necessarily welcome, but life happened as it does, and here we are being called to move through the suffering and move through this grief, whether we want to be pulled along with it or not. We can become numb to grief in both beautiful moments and subtle moments in which it is functioning, especially in relationships and within power dynamics. So in other words, by cutting ourselves off from that awareness that we are practicing to cultivate through our practice, we cut ourselves off from so many possibilities and opportunities for connection. And when we cut ourselves off from possibilities and opportunities for connection, that breeds disconnection, that breeds systems that disconnect people from themselves and from each other. And we ultimately weaken the possibility for impermanence to transform us, and therefore to allow us to transform the situations that we enter into, simply because we either ignore it and don't know that it's there, or it's there and working in toxic ways that don't bring about the transformation, the positive transformation that we ultimately hope to enact as socially engaged Buddhists. So I want to clarify and say that there's a difference between the type of grief brought about from past experiences, which is typically what people talk about when they think of grief, and grief tied to the present and the future. So when I'm talking about grief related to the present and the future, with impermanence being present now and a part of the future, I typically call that fear of loss. And fear of loss is a type of grief that most of us are probably aware of. But in speaking of grief, or even the grief we're experiencing now and the grief that we experienced within 2020, the importance of addressing fear of loss as it relates to impermanence often is put on the back burner to address the suffering that has transpired from what is already happening. Right. So a lot of us, a lot of people and organizations have a really reactionary response to grief and actions, as opposed to being attentive to the present moment in order to discontinue the perpetuation of further harm and further violence. So the reality of impermanence essentially tells us that everything that we have right now, everything and everyone that we have come to love and we come to appreciate, we will ultimately lose those things, right? And we are born into this reality by virtue of the fact that we are mortal and we are given a life that we will ultimately lose. And even for people who aren't invested in this practice and haven't thought about this on a conscious level, there's still that subconscious awareness of the reality of impermanence and what that means on a day-to-day basis. Because it can't not be, right? Even if it's something that, especially a lot of younger folks that I work with in their 20s and 30s who aren't necessarily facing death or dying, but are maybe having trouble in their relationships. And they don't necessarily connect, their power issues or their control issues with their partner, whoever it might be, with their relationship to fear of loss and impermanence, because impermanence and grief and death, those are things that you think about at the end of your life. And 20-something, what does that have to do with being 20-something, right? But it has to do with everything. It's an awareness that we are constantly carrying with us, though certain circumstances and being at certain points in our life simply just makes us aware of what has already been there. Like a pandemic, it makes people much more aware of what has already been here, including the reality of impermanence and grief, including white supremacy and its downstream stream effects on communities of color, including classism and not raising the minimum wage. All of these things that have simply been there, but it takes certain circumstances for what's already existed to be brought to our attention and brought to the light. Now, I mentioned white supremacy and I mentioned racism, and I talked about things that are done subconsciously or seeds that have been sown previously and uprooting those toxic and harmful dynamics. Typically, when I talk about racism or grief as it relates to racism, people specifically think about the grief experienced by people who are suffering under the foot of white supremacy. And the same with sexism, the same with classism, the same with all of these systems. Like our minds go to the people who are directly suffering from these various systems. But in thinking about fear of loss and the importance of each of us as socially engaged Buddhists who are going into situations where we are serving suffering and vulnerable populations, it is equally important for each of us to be attentive to our own relationship to grief and fear of loss based on our privilege, right? An example of this would be, I was talking to a friend not too long ago, maybe a couple months ago, and she was telling me about how her CEO gave a talk, which he gives yearly, to the company. And this company has certain metrics that they make public every year around the number of women they're going to hire, the number of people of color they're going to hire, the number of marginalized people in different leadership positions and different departments. So they publish these goals and these metrics. And at the beginning of each year, they meet with the company or everyone in the company, whoever wants to join, and they discuss the previous year's metrics, and then they set goals for the upcoming year. And after the CEO, gave those numbers, and after 2020, they became more aggressive with ensuring that they met those goals. He opened up Q&A to the audience for feedback and to answer their questions. And my friend shared how surprised she was at the number of white people who walked up and asked if hiring more Black people or having certain diversity initiatives would mean that there would be less white people hired for positions. And the same thing with men, like if you're hiring more women for these positions, and does that mean that there will be less men who get to have these positions, right? And that didn't sit right with my friend. And the CEO responded with a very placating response and assured people that that is not what that meant. And I really sat with this and the consequences of him giving that response and the consequence of him being grief avoidant and him not honoring the importance of tackling, you know, the reality of impermanence as it relates to privilege and as it relates to, you know, having people with a privileged identity in a given situation really come to terms with their relationship to grief and impermanence in order to solve these systemic issues instead of being reactive, as I mentioned earlier, and simply responding after the harm has been done, right? And my first thought was, we have got to stop lying to people, you know? And my second thought was, of course, that means that there will be less white people who are hired for these positions or less men who are hired for these positions. If these goals are set with the acknowledgement that privilege exists, which sets an imbalance where people based on their race and their gender or what have you experience more opportunities by virtue of their identity. And if we're saying that we want to balance those scales, then that means that people who are used to getting more and don't know what it's like to feel less will start to feel that they are getting less because we are creating balance. Like if there are a finite number of roles in this company, and right now, if 80% of management positions are occupied by men or by white folks, and if we're saying that we want 50% to be women or 50% to be Black people and people of color, then yeah, that does mean that there will be loss. It means that when Brescia and Sherelle and DeMarcus and Shanita, whoever applies for a job with our resume, that we have an equal shot at the same position as someone with a name like Hannah or Chad or Sarah or a Eurocentric name, right? It means that we are all competing equally for the same opportunities, and we are creating a system of equity where one group of people or groups of people aren't suffering under the foot of a certain type of injustice. Right, racism or sexism, whatever it might be. And there's loss that comes with that. And there's loss that must be brought to the attention of people who have privilege in a given area if we are actually going to make headway. If tackling systemic oppression is more than just a conversation of theory. So, in the situation with jobs, if we are competing equally for a finite number of jobs, and if we are saying that we are balancing the systems of oppression, okay, so if you're used to having a certain number of jobs and options available to you, and now things are not as readily available, then that impacts your income, and that impacts your access to healthcare. And that impacts your family's access to healthcare, your children, your wife, or your spouse. That impacts where you can live. That impacts your child's access to certain school systems, which impacts their future. Like, these are all things that are pushed on to marginalized people that we move through and navigate through on a daily basis. And it wreaks havoc on our lives long term. But if we are talking about, creating systems of equity, then there will be loss in the transition of, shifting from a system that is favoring white people within white supremacy or men within patriarchy. So honoring the importance of impermanence and recognizing the way that it is functioning in our day-to-day lives, and being intimately aware of our relationship to grief and impermanence, not just as it relates to things that have already occurred, but as it relates to the things that we want to transpire to our present moment and the future that we actually want to actualize in doing this work is exceedingly important for each of us, exceedingly important for each of us to attend to for ourselves, not just in theory. And as socially engaged Buddhists, we have a practice that comes with tools that help us move through these transitions, whether it's a practice in sitting itself or the Eightfold Path. We are given tools that call us to transform our own suffering so that we can do this work effectively. So a lot of religious traditions have a lot to say about the blood moon and its meaning. For myself, I grew up Christian, Southern Baptist to be exact. And in Joel, the idea of the blood moon is that it represents the end of times. And in a way, that's accurate, except the end of times isn't always negative and doom, which feels awkward to say in the middle of a pandemic. But when we're calling or talking about the end of times as it relates to the end of the reign of white supremacy and American imperialism and of classism and these various forms of systemic oppression, this is a painful moment that each of us are moving through. And we are really being called to be attentive to what that means and what we're carrying. So we're at a place in our nation's history in particular where things that have been done in the dark have just taken off and have grown unchecked for centuries. The seeds of ignorance, the seeds of hatred, the seeds of delusion and avoidance have all come full circle. And we are seeing what it means for those things to be moved out of the darkness and into our awareness very intimately. And much like the moon orbiting around the earth, these things have come full circle, and we are being invited to come full circle with it, to align ourselves and to make a commitment to ourselves and to the people that we serve. So in conclusion, impermanence is not merely about what we are being asked to let go. And it's not merely about things that have already transpired in the past. Impermanence also asks us to look at what we are called to embrace for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Brisha.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we'll transition now into a discussion, and I just want to take this pause to thank everyone who's joining us on Facebook for joining us for our Wednesday night talk. And I know many of you are here locally, and I might see you tomorrow afternoon for our second in-person Zazen at 5:30. So I hope you'll join if you're in the neighborhood. So thank you for joining us tonight. And Brisha, thank you for that deep dive into grief and loss and the way we understand it through the lens of practice and dharma in our society right now, and bringing light to the shadow. And I want to just open it right up to question and answers. And I'm happy to call on people if that's easiest for you, unless you want to run that show.
Oh, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, I'll call on people. So if whomever wants to ask a question or add to what Brisha's offered tonight, if you want to raise your hand, your digital hand, I'm not going to see your physical hand most probably. And while people are kind of digesting what you've offered, Brisha, I wonder if you could tease out further noticing that we equate, that there's this aspect, this substrate of grief within impermanence, and we equate so often grief with something negative, even though it's just something present kind of at all times in our life of change. And that we can have this aversive relationship to it. We don't want something to change. We want to sugarcoat the change. There's kinds of change that terrify us. And if we don't, this is what I'm hearing you say, so you can, correct me at any point, but if we don't really acknowledge it and invite it into our life, into our practice, it can become a kind of subconscious driver. It can drive us towards all sorts of behaviors that we're not aware of. And so I wonder if you could tease out more for us, what are the ways in which we bring those things into the light that are not there for us, when we're, not even noticing that we're averting our eyes, or that we'd rather keep something in the shadow. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, for your first question, in terms of teasing out the acceptance of impermanence in people, viewing impermanence as something negative that they don't really want to experience. I think that we are frequently, as people, in power struggles with external forces, and that just manifests in the power struggles that we have with each other, and one-on-one dynamics, and then largely societally, and the power dynamic with the reality of impermanence, or things that are outside of ourselves that we ultimately can't control, manifests in us attempting to control and overpower the very thing that we feel will overcome and overpower us, because we don't want to feel weakened by it. We don't want to feel vulnerable, and even that needs some tweaking. So I think that there's confusion between the difference between control and influence. And frequently people seek to control circumstances so that they can then hijack or subvert power in a given situation, and they don't feel like they've been rendered powerless. But when we embrace the reality of impermanence and acknowledge that power isn't ours to have or to take, either from life and the circumstances around us or from other people, however we can show up and influence circumstances, the dynamic changes. And that's really important when doing any type of, socially engaged work, and when doing work within our own lives. Like, I can influence whether or not I develop certain health conditions, but I can't necessarily control it, right? I can influence if I get into a car accident, but by driving safely and taking precautions, but I can't necessarily control it because I can't control my environment. And the same when interacting, with various communities. You can't control the other person. You can't control this institution, but you are here to be an influence by how you choose to show up.
Right. I so appreciate the reframing, particularly how control can include the very suffering, or inevitably includes the very suffering we're trying to avoid when we try and control, and that we never control. And so it includes the fear of loss of control and the inevitable loss of control. Whereas we always influence, we're always influencing our surroundings, each other. The way we are influences those around us. So that's very potent. But I'm gonna step back and we'll start inviting people in. And Jody, would you mind starting us off? I'm gonna ask to unmute you.
Thank you, Brisha, for a really interesting words and really helpful content. I'm curious, I think we all experience where people are really good at talking the talk, but not necessarily walking the walk. And your comments about fear and just the complication of why people will do that I think are spot on. I'm curious, in the situation where the CEO was placating his audience, and obviously you've done a lot of reflecting on that. If you were in that position, what would you have said?
I would acknowledge the truth if I were the CEO.
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
I would acknowledge the truth as I have now and what that means.
So I think that, can I ask you to take that just a little bit farther and create some context for the words? Because what happens for people, well, I can't say what happens for people, but it's so rare to hear people have the courage to show the vulnerability, to be honest. You know, obviously this company is portraying a picture of inclusivity and all kinds of things. And when asked to be honest and vulnerable and clear, the CEO was unable to come up with those words.
Absolutely. And I think I like what Sensei Allen says about the precepts. You know, they aren't meant to be kept, they're meant to be returned to. And I think of the practice in the same way. And for this CEO, being honest and being vulnerable is a practice, especially in a culture where we aren't taught to do this, right? And that was an imperfect moment. And that was an imperfect moment that had major consequences and took place in front of a lot of people, it sounds like. And it would take practice for him, to accept what this means and the discomfort of what this means, the discomfort of what it means for the company to actually live up to its goals. Because I'm not unfamiliar with seeing companies, you know, make lofty statements on their websites. But in practice, you know, if I join the company myself, or if I'm doing a workshop with the company, seeing the inner workings, it takes time and a lot to shift an entire institution and culture in the direction that it wants to go. And it's not happening as fast as we'd like it to, or as it needs to, you know, despite the lofty claims on a website. So if I were the CEO, I would given that I'm coming from a chaplain background, right? Like I've been practicing for a while, and am more comfortable with the reality of impermanence, even though it still shakes me up. But I would be honest about, you know, what this means. Yes, this does mean less jobs for you, and then perhaps offer workshops and support for you know, people who are struggling with that privilege and what that means.
Thank you. One of your comments was about guiding people through the process, grief and impermanence. And so I think for a lot of people, they need to learn, you know, they haven't been shown how to be honest.
Yeah.
And so they need to learn. And that's why listening to somebody like you that does have a really deep background in practice is really helpful. So thank you.
Thank you for your question. It's very honest.
Thank you, Jody. And Jen, before we go to you, I'm going to ask if there are people who have not spoken or have never spoken in one of our discussions after a Dharma talk. I really invite you to step in. Diana, I see you're one. And you know, there are many of us, and it can be daunting to speak in front of a lot of people, many of whom you don't know. But we're just having a conversation. There's nothing at stake. So I really encourage you to step in if you haven't before. And Jen, we'll go to you next.
Okay. Well, Jody just actually brought up something that I was going to talk about. So I'm happy to step back if you want to bring in other people who haven't spoken. Just very quickly, thank you for this really rich discussion about grief and impermanence. And I think it gave me a lot of different ways to think about this that I really hadn't. And I guess just the one thing I would add about the anecdote about the CEO that it really struck me to kind of tag on to what Jody was saying is, you know, when we talk about dismantling oppression and white supremacy, you know, this whole element of grief, I think in political work and in social change work, at least the ones I've been in, it's not a topic that's often addressed.
Mhm.
And there is this kind of, glossing over of loss. And I understand why, because maybe the CEO thought, well, I'm going to alienate these white employees if I'm honest.
Mhm.
And maybe I'll even lose my position if I'm too honest, which is a reality that could happen. But I just think also and I include myself here, in my own past as an activist, it's, grief is not even in the vocabulary or the kind of political or social justice training traditionally a lot of us have had, or at least that I've had. So thank you for giving us new ways to think of it.
Thank you for that feedback.
Thanks, Jen. Diana, I'm going to ask to unmute you next.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for really a wonderful and thoughtful talk. I think what you bring up about grief is so important. But I'm also wondering, how do we as individuals or even as systemic society sort of uproot these more subtle underlying and unrecognized grief or fear of loss? What I see is even when people are encountering the big grief of a very close loss, a death, that there's a desire to move away from it. And there's a desire of other people to have them move away from it, to have it be unacknowledged. And we have, as you mentioned, gone through some very big changes, and we're in the middle of hopefully some more changes that are coming. And it seems like these griefs, this loss, just keeps going forward and accumulating and being unacknowledged. And I'm wondering how we can sort of help to bring that forward, to be recognized, to be acknowledged in ourselves, but also in society.
Yeah, that's a question that comes up commonly for me, who wants this done faster, obviously. So, and for people who I work with who see the harm that these systems are causing, and then see all the people within the system and want to uproot it, as I mentioned, and as you mentioned. And for me, when I'm talking, I mentioned, the difference between control and influence. When I think about my personal transformational process and what it means for me to enter into these situations as, someone who has undergone certain transformation and is, creating that space for others to also be transformed, so that we can all, heal together and collectively transform these systems. I recognize this isn't going to happen overnight. And I recognize what that means for me and for people I love in terms of the continued grief and loss and suffering that we face. These systems and the dynamics that have supported them have been around for countless years. I think about, the verse of atonement, all our ancient twisted karma, right? All of this is a manifestation of our ancient twisted karma. And right now, white supremacy is the specific manifestation of what humans have been grappling with since the beginning of time. And I firmly believe that if we would dismantle white supremacy, which we need to do, nothing would stop another system from popping up in its place, to take its place, if we aren't addressing the roots of what causes humans to enact these harmful dynamics. And knowing that I can't control the transformation process or control the actions of another person, no more than I can control a wave when I'm swimming, right? Knowing that I can be out in the ocean, I can be in the pool, I'm swimming. I would very much like to get to where I'm going, but I cannot control my environment. All I can do is influence how I'm moving through the water and do my part and hope to get there. That's how I approach this work, continuing to show up and continuing to do my part while recognizing that this is too big for me to dismantle on my own or even to tackle in this lifetime, and to sit with the grief of what that means.
Thank you.
Thanks, Diana. Virginia, I'm going to do the same. I'm going to ask to unmute you, so you should see there you go.
Thank you, Breja, and thank you for the others who have asked questions that are similar to what was in my thoughts and heart. And part of it is about this, that we are aware of grief often on a personal level, when we experience a loss directly, or someone we know experiences that. But what you're talking about is really a lot of collective loss and a lot of collective grief. And I just wondered if you had some thoughts about compassion in the face of this real collective grieving, much of which is unacknowledged, as you said, and yet we may perceive it when we do something to try to influence these systems. And I would say I'm personally experiencing a little bit of that with having written some things that are causing upset and causing, some people to want me to not speak about certain things. So it's real in terms of if we go out there and put ourselves in the position of trying to make change, even if we perceive it as positive change, that it may not be perceived that way, and it may be causing others to have grief.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, that's real, right? And none of this work is easy. And sometimes, for me, without this practice, which helped guide my moral compass and what I do, and without, a community of friends and people to hold me accountable, it can be very easy to take that external feedback, especially with social media and people having, access to each of us so readily, and lose sight of what we're actually doing and why. We take an action with the intention of being compassionate, and then it's met with anger and pushback and grief. And then, it can be easy to question, well, was this actually right action, right? Was this actually from a place of compassion? And I would say that compassion is frequently misunderstood, and that, frequently people recognize compassion when it feels good, and when it feels nice. Roshi has something to say. I don't remember the quote about being compassionate versus being kind or nice. I'm sure she'll say it. I'm sure you'll hear it at some point. But it was spot on. And that, when we talk about compassion, sometimes compassion involves destruction. If we're tackling systemic oppression and systemic trauma, we're tackling white supremacy, like we are calling for the destruction of the system. Okay, that is stemming from an act of compassion, and that is destruction stemming from the act of compassion, right? To save countless lives. And that's not frequently explored by people who just expect compassion to mean that just lay down and be nice.
Risha, thank you. I just want to point out something that I think is really important. And it is you bringing up the issue of privilege in the way that you did. And that is to say that most everyone who has a privilege by nature or by virtue of their skin, their education, their role in life, most are not aware that they're enjoying privilege. And I think your point is so fascinating, to say that when privilege is threatened, when our privilege is threatened, it becomes something that has to do with our survival for those who are enjoying privilege. And there's an unwillingness to actually see the privilege that we are part of. And as a result of that, there's no capacity to actually meet a world with any sense of equity or, the first paramita of generosity, this kind of generosity of mind. Because there's this sense also of profound threat that we will lose our privilege. And when you talk about the future vis-a-vis grief, I think this is, and also the threat that people of privilege unconsciously experience. I think it's a really important point to bring these two dynamics together. The experience of privilege, which is not accessible to most people who are privileged. They don't realize it. They don't realize their privilege. And the second is to understand that at the pre-conscious level, that the potential loss of privilege is also grinding, underneath the skin of the psyche that is reifying the clinging to privilege. I think your story was really fascinating. Of course, if there is going to be equity, fewer white people, including white males, are going to have access in the same way that they have had access in the past and are, currently have access. So I deeply appreciate you connecting this issue of grief and privilege. But I think my question is, how do we create the conditions where people actually recognize their privilege and begin to dismantle it?
Yeah. Are you asking me that question to answer?
I am.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. I think that type of awakening starts with each of us recognizing the privileges that we have when we can, being attentive to it, working on our relationship to impermanence and grief with that, and then carrying that forward. So if I'm going to use the example of being American, or the example of, coming from a Christian background, or even the example of working as a chaplain in an institution, right? Like, these are situations in which I'm carrying a privilege with the people I am interacting with. And that, I think, in doing this other work, being attentive to those experiences where I have privilege and I've caused harm unintentionally, and I've experienced that shame and that grief and that pushback within myself when being encountered with those privileges, because, hey, I have all these other identities, right? Being attentive to that experience for myself and inviting other people who share those same privileges to be attentive to their experience can at least shed light on awareness, and then being open to the feedback that we receive after gaining that awareness from people who we are serving and don't have the same privilege and relationship to us. And it's an imperfect process.
I feel like this is an area that we really need to look more closely at, this issue of making privilege conscious and how we dismantle our own privilege, and also the sectors of privilege within our society. I thank you for making that connection so beautifully.
So Brisha, shall we take one more question or two more questions? What are you up for?
I'm flexible.
Okay. We have a few more minutes till the hour. So Diana, if you want to step in.
Thank you for just the wisdom and the depth of this presentation. I am struck by the work that we need to do in terms of grief counseling, right? What skills, what do we bring to the table to help people who, I know this sounds like it's the wrong side of the balance, but if we know from what you said, that if we're facing fear and loss and the struggle to hold on to control of anything that we think we're going to lose, then we need to come up with almost a toolkit of technology to ease people into accepting the losses that are indeed necessary, mandatory for justice to be able to be enacted, because privilege as it exists in our society right now is so imbalanced. So what, from your work and your skills, what do you think would be the most critical tools we could bring with us as we go to address and rebalance where we are right now, so that those with claws can maybe soften their claws and let go?
Yeah. To be real, I'm a fan of expedient means, but I'm not necessarily a fan or a practitioner of being gentle. So, when I think about what is going to accomplish my end goal, sometimes that's not being gentle. Oftentimes, it definitely means not going in with a hedge hammer and, hitting people over the head with whatever point I want to drive home. But I think about, just returning to the practice and what it means to have a meditation practice that cultivates awareness as opposed to this watered down, I don't know, rendition of mindfulness that we're packaged, that it's basically sold to us as relaxations within institutions. Mindfulness practice is not meant, or the meditation practice isn't meant to be relaxing, though it's meant to be grounded. And when you are grounded and aware, it facilitates the moving through suffering and encountering our grief. So that is a major tool I've returned to for myself, and that is what I use when working with people and organizations.
So we use a sledgehammer. And then
don't use a sledgehammer. Do not use a sledgehammer.
I mean, I just think sledgehammer, knock down the wall, and then reconciliation tools thereafter.
No, not the sledge. I mean, expedient, but maybe not the sledgehammer.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Diana. Leslie, you'll be our last question today. Oh, sorry. I re-muted you. That was my fault. There you go.
Okay. Thank you so much, Prisha. And Prisha. Okay. This is just a little comment on what's happening in my local community during the 1.5 years of pandemic to address white privilege, kind of taking advantage of the suffering of COVID and how it has actually softened a lot of people's hearts and opened a lot of people's hearts, and because the suffering is very common and widespread, and sort of using it as a lever. There was a grassroots effort to create something called radical community care, where white people have been encouraged to give their economic stimulus checks to primarily people of color in need, losing housing, losing jobs, having to stay home, not having daycare, et cetera, et cetera. And, it's just an attempt to address an imbalance and create a little bit more balance in terms of wealth and resources. And, I don't know what will happen beyond after COVID, but I just thought I'd mention that as one way.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I've also noticed that the pandemic has really, as you said, softened people's hearts. And I think it's, from what I've observed, these various systems of privilege and oppression really work by even removing the people who are experiencing privilege from their own humanity, right? So, they lose touch with their own relationship to grief and what it means to feel human. And that's kind of the point. Like, these systems are built to protect, people based on their identities from having to experience that because somebody else is experiencing it at a higher cost. So when you have something as huge as a pandemic that really threatens everybody's, personhood and mortality, and we're all experiencing that grief, it just opens up the possibility to have other conversations.
Anyway, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Appreciate it. Thank you dearly for bringing us into this conversation of grief and privilege and turning towards instead of turning away. And I think it's a thread we're going to pick up a lot this year in SCBT and have already, but to bring it to this kind of light. Is there anything else you want to add before we close? And we'll close with the 4 vows.
No, thank you everyone for your participation and your presence.
So I believe the Zendo will lead us, and we'll close together with the 4 Bodhisattva vows.
Transform them. Reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. The awakened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. Creations are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to transform them. Reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. The awakened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. Creations are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to transform them. Reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. The awakened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it.
Good night, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And next week, same day, we'll have Wendy Johnson joining us for the evening Dharma talk. And then we'll have our full SCBT session on Thursday, doing a little bit of synthesis of what we've gone through the past few months.